Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Industry Insights. I'm your host for today, Leah, and I am joined today by the inimitable Jason Buffington. Jason, thank you so much for joining me today.
We are all mostly celebrating Veeam off and just recovering from an amazing week, but I never miss a chance to spend time with you. So thanks for having me this week.
Absolutely. And we certainly had a great time last week. We hope you all were able to join us on our live streams or check out those recordings. We had a great opportunity to break down all three of our major research reports, our data protection trends report, our cloud protection trends report, and our ransomware trends report. Good gravy. Today is one of those days where you just get tongue-tied. So please bear with us today. But of course, we are going to be really diving into all things ransomware in our series for Industry Insights. And everything's really going to be pulling from our Ransomware Trends Report. Veeam, of course, is really taking a lot of pride in the fact that we want to better understand what is going on with our community. We are not the kind of organization that just wants to push speeds and feeds onto everyone saying our product is the best and most pretty. We recognize that backup is a small part in a much bigger story that so many of your organizations are having to contend with, whether it be ransomware or other kinds of business disruptions, whether you're looking to do innovations. We know that there is so much that you're trying to accomplish as an IT team and as an organization, and we are just grateful to be a very small part of that. So to make sure that we better understand your needs, Veeam has really been conducting some amazing research with third-party firms to better understand what is going on as we look at data protection trends, how data is moving to IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, cloud storage, as organizations are looking at as-a-service models in general for data protection. And then, of course, what is going on with some of the top business disruptions around cybersecurity and ransomware. So today, we're going to talk at a very high level about some of those sort of macro trends. What is in the state of the business around responding to ransomware attacks in 2023? And then in our series from here, we're going to break down some of those major themes, including how you gain organizational alignment and other really challenging things that your organization may be facing. Before we get started with that, though, we want to go ahead and pull up the map because, of course, we are calling in today from all around the world for you guys. We have production in the United States here. I'm calling in from Columbus, Ohio. Go Buckeyes. We have some folks as well from the great state of Texas, including Jason, of course. And then absolutely. I won't say some of the other Texas teams. I could say some hook 'em horns in there if I just wanted to rile you up. But we also have some folks joining us from around the world as well. Thank you so much to the folks joining us from Italy. My brother and sister-in-law will actually be traveling to Italy next week. I am very much looking forward to their pictures. Right now they're in Marrakesh. So I am very jealous of the food that they are eating this week and jealous in general because I am here in Columbus, Ohio, instead of somewhere very cool like that. So please let us know in the chat from whatever platform you're joining us on where you are calling in from, because we would love to light up that map more. Of course, when it comes to recovery and resiliency, it's all about the community because staying up to date on the latest trends is ultimately how we are going to keep ahead of bad actors. So definitely we want to know where you're calling in from, and we will check in on that map in the minutes ahead. So let us know for sure. But with that, Jason, I think we'd like to go ahead and dive in a little bit to some of this data and talk at a high level. What were some of the top takeaways we had from the Ransomware Trends Report? So we can go ahead and pull up our first chart here. We wanted to just give a table stakes sort of diagram here, right? This is just demonstrating how common ransomware attacks are. And I know that it can be really challenging for organizations to even talk openly about their experiences with ransomware attacks. So many companies have policies and requirements that you don't publicly disclose whenever you have had some kind of ransomware attack. So having these sort of anonymous surveys like this hopefully gives you a sort of comfort and better understanding of what you might be experiencing and how it fits into the bigger picture. So one of our big takeaways, because I just think this is a very alarming stat, more organizations were hit quarterly than believe they were not hit at all, right? 75% of all organizations who responded to this survey reported suffering a ransomware attack in 2023, but it was more common to be hit quarterly. than it was to be hit at all. So Jason, I think that was a really not surprising stat. I think it's, again, a table stakes stat, but it is kind of a horrifying stat to realize just how common the onslaught is of successful attacks. Do you want to break this down a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got the punchline right. So more organizations got hit quarterly than not at all. But I'm going to tell you that even that is probably an optimistic lens. And I think there's
Yep.
two nuances to that that's worth talking about. When you look at that green bar, right? So 25% of orgs believe they were not hit. And I'm going to use that verb consistently. Believe doesn't mean wasn't, means believe. And the reason why, there's two things. One, you brought up a great point. Not everyone wants to talk about it, right? And if you weren't in the part of the org that was directly addressing that issue, it might be that you're not even aware of all of the issues. But I think probably a bigger scenario is the fact that we hear from security vendors all the time that the average gestation rate after the bad actor has penetrated the environment can be up to 200 days. Right. So this question was asked, were you hit in the last year? Well, 200 days, that's more than half a year away. So statistically speaking, some of those folks have been breached. The bad actor is exploring different kinds of exploits. They're looking for where you didn't patch. They're looking for where you used default password. They're still in discovery mode within your environment. In a couple of weeks, we're going to revisit this idea and talk about what they're also doing to remove your ability to save yourself as part of it. But right now, they are a snake in the grass. They are looking around. So some of that 25% are unfortunately breached and not yet aware. But if you take all of that imagination aside, still the best case is 1 out of 4 have not been hit. Best case, right? But as you said, more folks got hit quarterly than not at all along the way. So that's kind of our first nuance on it. And now this data comes from the unbiased panels from our data protection trends report, where we look at what are the top line macro trends. There was a second trend related to cyber that I think want to keep in the same conversation. And that is the independent research firms went off and asked, okay, so what caused outages in your environment over time? And yes, you should see on the top list, by the way, it's a really busy chart. I apologize for that. But the top of the chart, yes, cyber events. The long lines are most common. Cyber was the most common cause of outages last year. The short lines were what was the single most impactful, and for 4 years running, cyber was the most impactful. But Leah, I want to draw your eye to everything else which is still on this list. So before we come out of the big screen, stay on big screen for just a minute. Take a look at infrastructure outage. Hard drives still fail. Applications still corrupt. Cloud still drops offline. Users still make silly choices. If you look on the bottom, fire still happens, flood still happens, tornado still happens. I'm going to use that last one as the example because I think there are some folks in our industry that, once upon a time, they opened their doors as a backup company, and now they think they're a cyber company because cyber is really spicy, right? But I'm going to tell you this, if all you're doing is preparing for flood, as an example, right? So how do I waterproof this? How do I waterproof that? How do I protect against flood? And then you have a fire, you ain't going to have any water around to put out the fire, right? And so when you over-rotate on one of the scenarios that's required for data protection, you run the risk of being radically underprepared for all the other reasons why data protection, disaster recovery, business continuity, cyber resiliency all still matter along the way. What are your thoughts when you see the myriad of crises that that organizations are still facing in 2024?
I think what's interesting and hopefully exciting for folks who have been in backup for a long time is that I think a cybersecurity event being the most impactful disaster, the most common disaster, it just becomes yet another example of why you need to have a confident business continuity and disaster recovery plan. I think ultimately a lot of these outages that have occurred tend to really reside as a responsibility within the IT team themselves. And now that you're reaching across the aisle and really having to work hand in hand with security teams, it's illuminating pain points that many of us have already been feeling. And I think, Jason, you brought up a really good point, which is that while business continuity and disaster recovery may be getting more emphasis, which is lovely, as a result of cybersecurity proliferation, I think it doesn't necessarily make sense to use a hammer when you need a screwdriver, right? When you need some other kind of tool. So it's really important to have that business continuity disaster recovery planning for all kinds of scenarios, especially when you take a look at things like, cloud or application software outage, SaaS outages, the kinds of tools that make sense for your infrastructure failing, your networking going down, your logins going down. It's not necessarily the same thing as needing to recover individual files, right? Or move an application from one availability zone of Azure to another availability zone of Azure. Those require completely different skills and tools. So hopefully this is just illuminating that you need a plan, but hopefully there aren't folks out there who think a hammer will work for all kinds of scenarios. You definitely need more of a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, I love what Marco made a comment on LinkedIn platform on cyber topping server failures along the way. I earned this gray beard in the data protection space. I have been backing stuff up for 35 years, and we have always assumed, hard drives are going to fail. Right. We've always assumed that we're going to have a server componentry that is going to break. And so over time, certainly the mean time between failure, MTBF, of components has gotten somewhat better. I love the fact that most data centers today do actually have an architecture that allows for durability, which is not the same thing as resiliency or high availability or any of the other fancy buzzwords that are out there, but simply the durability of you should assume componentry level failure, right? And so how do you architect, whether that's with clustering, whether that's with replication and failover? There's lots of ways to address for that. That said, I'm going to tell you that when you look at, let's say, the some of the lines here, let me see if I can get a pointer up for the kids at home. There we go. When you look at most impactful failures over time, you're actually not seeing any of those other things go down that much. The qualitative improvements in things like so networking has gone down a little bit. That is becoming less and less the most impactful. But what you don't see is you don't see these blue lines shrinking. And here's what I mean by that. The warm lines are what was most impactful. And so cyber is taking more than its share year over year. But the blue lines on frequency of other attacks isn't going away, right? You're not seeing a radical decline in hard drive failure, right? You're not seeing a radical decline in admin error. Right? You're not even seeing a radical decline in natural disasters, right? 1 out of 4 still have something that happens: water, fire, flood, earthquake, tornado, something that gets in the way of your business. So the other blue lines aren't going away, which is why if you over rotate and just think about, got to bring the cyber team in, got to bring the CISOs in, and you're not still including IT ops, DevOps, the business stakeholders for all those other things, you are radically short-sighting your preparedness. In fact, I'm at a business continuity event up in Cambridge, Mass, in just a couple of weeks. We're talking about all the myriad things relating to interrupting business, many of which don't even have anything to do with IT. All right, that being said, cyber is the topic for the next 6 weeks. Let's talk about what are we doing to do that. So in these first 2 slides, these were all from the core IT leader or IT implementer responsible for data protection of their organization. As we've seen, cyber continues to top the list. So we went off and commissioned a second report. We went off to different research firms. We had them go and survey only organizations who self-reported they suffered at least one breach in the preceding 12 months. Now, there's a couple really important nuances in the research that we're going to unpack over the several weeks. The first of which, starting with, hit that QR code. Dang it. It's in the upper right-hand corner on every one of these slides. Yeah, some of the slides are hard to read. Go download the whole report. You can have your very own copy of these very same charts. One of the things that we do in this research is, especially for ransomware, no single role in an organization can adequately protect a company from ransomware. So no single role should be certified or should be surveyed to decide how big is the problem and where should it be fixed. So in this particular research, we actually survey 3 different kinds of respondents. There is the backup admins. Those are in a lovely shade of Veeam green. We love backup admins, right? There are security professionals in orange in the lower left-hand corner. So now you've got not only the folks responsible for remediation, but also the folks responsible for prevention. And then in blue, we've got the CISO or the similar executive, that top line stakeholder who is ultimately accountable for either the prevention, the remediation, or frankly, the survivability from what is arguably an inevitable strike. I'll also point out, Leah, that ransomware is an equal opportunity offender. It can hit SMBs, it can hit commercial, it can hit enterprise, it can hit large enterprise, it can hit private, it can hit public. And so it can hit in the Americas, it can hit in EMEA, it can hit in APJ, in a house with a mouse, in a fox with a box. It can go anywhere, right? So our survey actually is inclusive of global surveys, so it's around the world, and organizations of all sizes. But Leah, probably the most important thing I should point out, not Veeam customers, right? We don't
Right.
specifically exclude them, but we really want to I guess statistically market share, we've got 12%. So I guess roughly 12% of them probably are using Veeam. But candidly, as someone from the strategy side of Veeam, I am as interested, if not more, in what are the other 88% dealing with in market, as opposed to simply the 12 that we already delight and serve. So these are not indicative of simply Veeam customer responses along the way. I think that's super important to make sure the kids at home know.
It is. And honestly, if you were to ask the security professional or that CISO role, what backup tool do you use? A lot of the times they go, uh, because,
Right.
and frankly, they think that's not their job to even know that sometimes. So I think that just proves positive that this is a evolving set of issues, that this game of hot potato of who has the responsibility, who's on first, it's just illuminating a lot of dysfunction that we have reaching across the aisle. Not to tease too much into future episodes that we have, but that may be something that we talk about.
Yeah. And in fact, that's probably a good segue. So let's kind of dig in on a couple of things that I think are really interesting. One of the bread and butter questions, it doesn't always come up in the report, but we've had this mindset that we've learned over the last several years as we've talked to so many organizations over time, around the idea of, do you treat cyber differently than you treat other kinds of crises at scale? Right. And so, when you think about fire and flood and some of the natural, I'm an old school business continuity disaster recovery person. So let me just admit that, as full disclosure. And so when I think about, hey, I'm going to recover from fire or flood, that's going to affect a large amount of infrastructure. But if the servers were on fire, I know I just have to restart the crispy ones someplace else. If the servers were in a flood, I know I just have to deal with the drippy ones, right? So there's a very easy way to perceive that. When we talk about cyber, though, the problem is that those servers are still powered up and the blinky lights are still blinking, and so you do have to have this distraction around, okay, how to identify what actually is clean versus what actually has to be recovered. And then you go back to all the challenges at scale.
Right.
So I love the fact that for most organizations today, they do treat ransomware as a kind of disaster, meaning they think about it as an IT outage at scale. And that's lovely, Leah. But let me bring you to, and by the way, for the most part, 36% say completely integrated, one plan. 48% mostly integrated. Okay, they're still kind of working on the nuances, but they respect. There's some secondary stakeholders here, and I think that's 84%-ish along the way. One strategy, but it's almost like, and you brought up that little team up in Ohio, I brought up the Aggies. It's almost like the offense and the defense aren't working off the same playbook, right? Because when we asked organizations how aligned are the backup teams and the cybersecurity teams, 62% of the respondents across all three panels said that either a significant improvement or a complete overhaul is needed between these two teams to work together. Now, next week, we're going to actually spend the whole episode talking about organizational alignment, organizational preparedness, what all the teams are doing along the way. But I think this is an interesting top line point to talk about. And maybe the homework for the kids at home is go invite if you're a backup person, invite your security friend to that session, right? It's kind of like in church, bring a friend to church week, whatever, we do that a couple times a year. Or bring your exec, right? Someone who may not have time for the report. This is something that I think is worth talking a lot about. Leah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it absolutely is, because I think it just continues to illuminate this hot potato game, that so many organizations are saying, okay, well, if I'm on the cyber team, I'm going to assume that the other guys have this sort of plan to recover. And if I'm on the backup team, I'm going to assume that as long as I follow the policies set by the security team, I'm golden. And the reality is, I think there needs to be a lot more coming together. And that's something that Veeam is ultimately committed to as well. We're certainly hearing that so often, whether it's from this kind of, again, third party research done without necessarily sitting in the echo chamber of our own community. But when we are in our own community, when we are talking to our own customers, longtime customers, they're facing this same kind of issue. They're hearing from their peers that they're contending with how much should we interweave some of these strategies together. And I think the genuine sentiment is that they should be more woven together. And again, you can see that from so much of this data here. A complete overhaul is required, I think, is a lot of what I verbally hear when folks are being honest. And so I think we're going to continue to see that moving forward. And part of that's going to be having a shared language, having shared frameworks, having shared enemies, right? It's not
Yeah.
just saying the bad actors, but what are the things, the little decisions that lead up to those bad actors getting in and wreaking havoc. So we definitely have a lot of work to do as a BCDR community. And again, hopefully we can be a small part of that in the weeks ahead with this ransomware trend series.
You know, one thing that I got to give props to the security vendor community is I think they actually do a much better job of, hey, we found a new signature, we found new threats, we found new processes that the bad folks are doing. And I think that community actually does recognize it is going to take a village. Um,
Yep.
the backup vendors have historically not been nearly as interested in collaboration per se, but I love seeing some of the new things they're unlocking as backup vendors are creating relationships and alliances with security vendors, so that by extension we're all hearing the same kinds of things along the way, so that we can all help the general population prevent, protect, and recover from these very common threats that we're all facing. You know, so we've talked about there's one set of policies, one set of strategies so far. That's in the right direction. This data shows, okay, the teams may not all be aligning, but I will say this: one of the other data points that I'm excited about is, okay, so maybe the teams aren't working off of the same playbook yet, but I do like the fact that most organizations are perceiving the need to invest in both prevention and remediation technologies as part of that existential threat. So one of the questions that was asked in this year was, how have your budgets changed? And you can see in orange, this is how the budgets have increased or decreased around prevention technologies. So let's just generally call that the cybersecurity budget. Right. And then in green, what about in the recovery backup BCDR technologies? So we're just going to call that the remediation or recovery side of things. Leah, there's two things I like about this. One, there is nearly equal investment on both sides. Yes, I don't mind putting a little bit more on prevention on the front, because the more you prevent, the less you have to recover from. Right. But the other thing I would point out to the kids at home is that if, depending on whether you like IDC or Gartner better, most of the highbrow analyst teams that look at the overall market are saying that overall IT spend for 2024 was only projected to increase 3.5, 3.75, up towards 4% investment. So, by the way, we saw 6.5 from data protection 6 months ago. It's 6.1 and 6.5 on this lens. Very consistent around, yes, everybody's getting more as an organization for IT, but prevention and recovery technologies are actually getting disproportionately more than their share, which just shows that some things in IT are still having to give away while we're doubling down on what really is an existential threat for most organizations.
Definitely. And I think so much of that comes down to the reality that organizations are seeing this imperative need, but it's also because I think there's some forcing functions for that, right? One of the trends that we're seeing that I think is fueling both of these categories of investment is all around compliance requirements, right? Yes, can you recover? Sure. But do you have a documented plan that can withstand an audit? If you don't, that may be where some of this investment might be coming in. And Jason, I know you're a big fan of documentation, so I purposely said that one to get you excited.
Yeah, who else? I mean, how can you not be excited about documentation? It is the proof that you are doing what you're supposed to be doing and that you are ready when the crisis inevitably happens. So everyone should be excited about documentation. What you're not excited about typically is the creation of the documentation. And so we have some tools for that we're going to help folks with over the next several weeks. All right. We're coming close on time, but I want to bring up one more data point. And I think this data point is going to basically be our North Star for the whole rest of the series. We're going to spend about 6 weeks looking at different nuances. You already mentioned next week we're going to talk more about organizational alignment. Then we're going to talk about budget impact and non-budgetary impacts to the organization during and after the crisis. We're going to go into methodology and planning, a little bit of tech. Let's bring up one more slide. And in this case, this is going to kind of ground us for the rest of the series. Bring this up full screen because I want to make sure the kids at home get a chance to screenshot this one. All right, so there's two questions that really got asked in the same vernacular. The first one is, did you pay or not? And then the second question, did it work? Right. So let's kind of unpack a few nuances in this. We're going to revisit this one a couple times over time, but I just want to give folks a taste of the rest of the series. First and foremost, 4 out of 5 folks paid. Right. 4 out of 5 organizations, 81% paid the ransom. Right? Regardless of whether you had a policy or not, regardless of if you had government prohibition or not, 4 out of 5 paid, right? As opposed to of the other 19% that didn't, 4, nothing was asked for. They were there for arson. They were there to do damage, right? And then only, and if I was on screen, I would tell you, holy crap, only, and you'd see expletives filled out in front of my face where you couldn't actually see what I said. Only 15% recovered without paying, right? Leah, I joke about this when we covered some of this data at Veeam. If I was in charge of marketing, I would say our entire mission in life is to help the other 85% of folks say, no, we did not pay. We recovered, right? But I am not in charge of marketing. I wake up every morning and I check, and today is not my day.
Well, and part of that is it's not just about the recovery part of it. Part of it is trying to prevent exfiltration and all sorts of other things. We're not trying to be facetious with all of that, but it's definitely something that is a huge mission of ours, because the reality is, when we do hear anecdotally, why did you pay? We are hearing so often it's because they didn't have the confidence that they could recover and keep their business up and running and protect brand reputation and. So it is very much a huge issue that the Veeam team is very worried about. But I think what's interesting too that you'll hear us talk more about is, we've got this really amazing partner now with this company that we recently purchased, Cofeware. So hopefully you all have heard of that. And one of the services that they provide is that they try to better understand the psychographics behind these, let's call them what they are, terrorist organizations, right? They're trying to better understand what those motivations are, and does it necessarily make sense to pay? So this is something that is going to be a full community effort. And Jason, I think you brought up a beautiful point earlier of the security community continues to really rally around best practice sharing and insight sharing. And hopefully Veeam is going to be a part of that as well too, because I think you can hear just how passionate we are about trying to avoid exactly this kind of scenario, because not only does it feed the wrong behaviors to kind of pay this ransom, but it is also incredibly expensive. It's time consuming. It is all the things that keep you away from your mission for whatever your organization is, whether you're trying to achieve patient outcomes or, you're just trying to keep Tiffany's super awesome flower shop up and running, whatever that mission is, this stands in the way of that. And ultimately, I think the Veeam team will continue to be really passionate about trying to avoid this from happening.
Yeah, let me just throw one more last thought on this before we kind of wrap for the end of our time. So as I said, we're going to revisit this slide a couple times during the course of the series, but I just want to draw your eye to that red nugget on that lower left-hand corner, all right? And by the way, for the kids at home, if you are multitasking, look up at your screens for 30 seconds and just kind of hear me out on this one. 27%, so 1 out of 4 overall of the victims. But more importantly, 27 out of the 81% who paid, that's the red plus the orange. That's how you get 81% is 4 out of 5 folks paid. But for 27 out of the 81, that is 1 out of 3. For 1 out of 3 of the victims who paid, they still couldn't recover afterwards. And so what I want to leave you with as a cheery note on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon is, what if that was you? What if you had a ransomware event? For whatever reason, you did not feel like you could recover. We're going to talk about some of the reasons why later in the series. You go to your boss's boss, somebody approves the Bitcoin, you lay the Bitcoin out, and you still couldn't recover. Because that is the experience of 1 out of 3 of the victims from last year. 1 out of 3 who paid still could not recover. In fact, I would argue, by the way, it's nearly 2 to 1 folks that paid but could not recover versus those that recovered without paying. We're going to spend some time on that later in the series, but ask yourself, if you paid and still could not recover, what happens to your business?
Mm-hmm.
Leah, wrap us up.
Absolutely. That's the big existential question of the day. And certainly we're already seeing in the comments, everyone's agreeing with you. I'm getting some ayes from folks like Casper. So thank you so much for your comments. If you would like to learn more about these insights, if you want to share the good word with your colleagues and within your own community, please go ahead and download that report. There's lots of options to do that. We've also had some great discussions with folks over the comment section. I think we're going to be replying to a few folks via email. If you have questions yourself, especially if that's a sort of confidential question that you can't put in a public forum, please feel free to email strategicresearch@veeam.com. We would love to engage with you. But with that, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to enjoy this lively discussion with us. We have many more to come around ransomware trends in the weeks ahead. So please be sure to stay tuned for industry insights, as well as our colleagues over at Tech Bytes on Thursdays. On behalf of Jason and myself, though, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to the next one.
Bye-bye.